Yeah, they had another one. Yeah. 90, I think they had another one. 90's when they all got stuck on the interstate. Yeah. Well, they don't know how to drive in the rain, let alone the snow. Well, they don't. But Alabama's worse than Georgia. Alabama likes to drive in a Tyson line all the time. What'd you think? Well, yeah, yeah. Yeah, right. Yeah, yeah.
Keep them straight. I was trying to. We put a swing with one every now and then. That's how they did it. Go back over. Well, I said, it's rough in the morning. That's a rare thing. If you see me.
Yeah. He's got a long way to go.
I've waited a whole week to say hello. Oh my. Okay, good morning, everyone. Glad to see everybody with us. Glad to have Rodney and Jerry with us this morning. I almost said Jimmy, but that's my neighbor. Sorry. It's close. It's close. Good to see Logan with us this morning as well. We'll go ahead, begin with a word of prayer. Well, I guess y'all would need books. Can you get Jerry and Rodney a book? Okay, we'll have a word of prayer and then we will go ahead, dive into, we're in lesson number 5 today in the workbook. We're going to be kind of going between the biblical text and the workbook itself, so it'll be kind of on and off in the book and in the book. Lum, can you lead us in prayer?
Thank you, Father, for the opportunity to get here this morning, worship you, study more of your word. Thank you, Father, that God will learn something each day that we need to know about you and your life. Be with us as we study with us the rest of this day.
Amen. When we get to the end of the Genesis account, we find the children of Israel are stuck in a promise. We find that famine takes Jacob and his family down to Egypt for a period of close to 200 years. But during that 200 years, we find that there's a development of a promise that's given at the end of Genesis chapter 50. If you want to look there just for a moment, Genesis 50, we find in verse number 19. Well, actually, let's begin in verse 24 because that's going to get closer to where we want. So at the end of Joseph's life, after he's delivered his family, Jacob's already died and he's already been taken back into Canaan. There was a promise that was made. Joseph said to his brethren, I am dying, but God will surely visit you and will bring you out of this land to the land of which he swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. Then Joseph took an oath from the children of Israel, saying, God will surely visit you, and you shall carry up my bones from here. So Joseph died, being 110 years old, and they embalmed him, and he was put in a coffin in Egypt. During this time frame of the death of Joseph, going to this Pharaoh that we're going to read about in Exodus chapter 1, there's a period of about 70 to 124 years that transpire before we get to this Pharaoh that knew not Joseph. I want you to look at Exodus chapter 1, beginning in verse number 8. Now, this Pharaoh who knew not Joseph, it was very common in Egyptian times if you found someone who was against mainstream religion. So if we're talking about Egypt, what kind of religious system did they normally follow? Multiple gods, polytheism. In fact, monotheism was a rarity during the days of the Egyptian gods. But if they found anything that challenged the cultural norm, they would try to erase it. In fact, you'll find in archaeology, there are some tombs where you'll find, have you heard the name of the queen Hatshepsut? Have you heard that name before? Okay, she is a very prominent queen. Some people believe this is actually the Pharaoh's daughter who picked up Moses. Egypt had a time period where they had what was called co-regions. You would have southern Egypt, lower Egypt, which was actually what we would call north, and there's upper Egypt, which is what we would call south. Now, down in the south, that's proper directions right there. But they looked at the Nile, or at least the ocean, as being like the furthest south you could go. And everything that proceeded from the water was a continuation of life. So where we would see the Mediterranean being north, they looked at that as being south. So they flipped the whole world, and they started thinking if we just go further inland, then we'll actually find life. They just found more desert. But anyways, where was I going with that? Religion. There was a time where they had co-regents. They had a king over the lower Egypt and they had a king over upper Egypt. And there was times during civil turmoil where the true Egyptian-blooded families were fighting over these people who were immigrants coming in, which, I mean, think of Joseph's backstory. He's an immigrant. He's not a full blood-born Egyptian. He is what we would consider a Hyksos. And you would read that name when you look into historical accounts. There were Hyksos who came in and they would try to fight for the royal crown. Ultimately, the Egyptian blood won. But during that time period, Hatshepsut ruled as a co-regent with the king that we read about in Exodus chapter 1. I want you to notice in verse number 8, this would be one of the first individuals who would come in kind of like a grandfather to Pharaoh's daughter that we'll read about here in a moment. Verse 8, Exodus 1, there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph, and he said to his people, look, the people of the children of Israel are more and mightier than we. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply, and it happen in the event of war that they also join our enemies and fight against us, and so go up out of the land. So they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with their burdens. And they built for Pharaoh supply cities, Pithom and Ramses. But the more they afflicted them, the more that they grew. And they were in dread of the children of Israel. So the Egyptians made the children of Israel serve with rigor. And they made their lives bitter with hard bondage, and mortar and brick, and in all manner of service in the field. All their service which they made them serve was with rigor. Now, pause. Let's do critical thinking exercise 1. Is it possible that maybe it could have been the case that the children of Israel could have grown to such an extent that they caused an uprising within their slavery and overtake their captors? Yeah, that's possible. Now, I want you to notice from this text in verse number 8 and 9, this was Pharaoh's first response to the growth problem. What's the problem with that? Well, that's true. He doesn't know that yet, but yeah, that's true. Do you tend to always make the right decision if you have a problem with someone and you don't actually ask them why they're doing what they're doing and or why they did what they did? You don't ask any questions, you just assume their motives, and then you end up thinking the worst. Anybody ever been guilty of that? I have, many times. Pharaoh is displaying this. Now, what I need to know before I jump into this text is that in Genesis 20 and in Genesis 26, I read of a man by the name of Abimelech. In fact, Genesis chapter 12 has a similar story. But I read of a story of a man by the name of Abimelech. Abimelech also had similar feelings like this Pharaoh right here, but it was towards Abraham in his blessings in chapter 20. It was towards Isaac in his blessings in chapter 26. What makes chapter 26 even more interesting than chapter 20, Abimelech's already gone through this issue with Abraham before, where Abraham said, "This woman is my sister," which she was. It was his half-sister, so legally that was his sister. But in chapter 26, Abimelech should have been familiar with Isaac. He should have been familiar with the family of Abraham. But Isaac did the same thing that Abraham did. He actually did lie, whereas Abraham did not. He said, "Rebekah is my sister. Don't say you're my wife." But then after they worked through that turmoil, the family kept growing and growing and growing. And Abimelech took his commander of his army to go talk with Isaac, to go make a deal with him. And that's where we have our second case in Genesis of this well by the name of Beersheba, the well of 7 oaths, or the perfect oath place. You have a pagan guy who is willing to make an agreement with a foreigner and not assume that his motives, because he's being blessed, his motives aren't, well, he's going to overtake us. You know, the only difference between this Pharaoh and the Pharaoh we read back at the beginning of Abraham's story is that Pharaoh was a generous king. In fact, think back, who put Joseph into power? I know God did, but who put Joseph into power? It was the Egyptian king. It was Pharaoh. Now, Pharaoh, during Joseph's time, was humble-hearted. In fact, he was willing to question and test things before he made an assertion about the situation. In fact, if you look into historical texts, you will find that the Egyptian kings had a book that they had to read and they had to live by. They were to basically die on behalf of Egypt. Basically, they were doing the duties of what any ruler would do. They're putting their people first before their own personal pleasure. This Pharaoh is acting in a way which is not very characteristic of the Egyptian values. He is an example of a bad Pharaoh, just like the one we're going to read about in Moses' story. But we know the rest of this story. There's a national genocide program that's put in place in verse number 15. And it would say that he had commanded all the Hebrew midwives that there was a son or a male child, they were to kill that child whenever he was born. And then we have the issue with Shiphrah and Puah. But I guarantee you there were more than just these 2 midwives. But the text only focuses on these 2 midwives. In summary, these 2 decide they don't lie, they just become lax in their duties. And it is the case that the children of Israel were multiplying fervently, which is why they make this statement in verse number 19. The midwife said to Pharaoh, "Because the Hebrew midwives are not like the Egyptian women, they are lively and give birth before the midwives come to them." That was true. Ever found yourself, you need to get something done, and man, you can think of all these other things you can do, and you go ahead and do all those things, but you still got that one thing you got to do. But man, I got all these other things I can do, and then you come back to the original problem. I still got to get this finished. Dragging your feet. That's what they do. They're not lying about this. The midwives are telling the truth here. Now, what I find what God does with these midwives is going to set up what we're going to talk about with Amram and Jochebed, the parents of Moses, here in a moment. Notice in verse 20 it would say, God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and grew very mightily. So it was because the midwives, key point, feared God. He provided households for them. These are the only 2 midwives that are mentioned in this text. Considering there were probably other Hebrew midwives, why is it just these 2 who are mentioned who actually stood against the king's verdict? Flip side of that coin, how many of them just complied with it? So when I'm looking at the blessing of a household, I'm finding initially in Exodus, there were individuals who understood this is not right. What Pharaoh is asking for is against life. It is against God. Hence it would say in the text they feared God. Now we get to our focus in the text. In chapter 2, it talks about there was a man of the tribe of Levi, and it said that he took as a wife a daughter of Levi. It's going to be 4 more chapters before I find out who the names of these 2 individuals are. I want you to hold your finger there for a second. Look over in Exodus 6. Exodus chapter 6, and let's look at verse... that's too much text. Let's start in verse 16. These are the names of the sons of Levi according to their generation: Gershon, Kohath, Merari. That's extremely important when you get to the book of Numbers. And the years of the life of Levi were 137. The sons of Gershom were Libni and Shimei according to their families. The sons of Kohath were Amram, Izhar, Hebron, and Uzziel. And the years of the life of Kohath were 133. The sons of Merari were Mali and Mushi. Doesn't mean he was emotional. And these are the families of Levi according to their generation. Now Amram took for himself Jochebed, his father's sister, as wife, and she bore him Aaron and Moses. And the years of the life of Amram were 137. The people I'm reading about in Exodus chapter 2 is this man by the name of Amram and his wife Jochebed. Now I'm also going to find out there's another child by the name of Miriam. I read her name first off in Exodus chapter 15, but I'm not really going to make the connection that Miriam is the sister of Moses until I get into the book of Numbers chapter 12. But besides all that, I have 2 individuals who I guess will put you in their predicament. You have a child. You find out it's a son. Well, there is a national genocide law that says if you have a son and you're Hebrew, your son's going to die. Now, how do you respond to that law? There's only 2 ways. You comply, and then it's on your mind the rest of your life, or you hide them. Now, did they do this without instruction? Let's go back to a very familiar time because it's fresh in our minds, mask and COVID. What was the right response? That required some thinking, and it required some mature decision making. In many facets. Who was right, who was wrong? Yes. That's the answer. There is a text that gives us insight as to why Jochebed and Amram did what they did. Now, they didn't do this because they said, we're not going to comply with the government. That's not what this text tells me. But it's Hebrews 11 that's going to fill in the gap to give me information. There's more that happened here than what the text is saying. Notice in Hebrews chapter 11, we're going to begin in the middle part of the text. Hebrews chapter 11 gives me a few insights to their son by the name of Moses, but it also gives me an insight to the parents of Moses during this national verdict. Notice in Hebrews 11, verse number 23. By faith, Moses, when he was born, was hidden 3 months by his parents because they saw he was a beautiful child and they were not afraid of the king's command. Now, is this a statement about Noah? No, it's not. Is this a statement about Moses as a child, by faith, hid himself? Or is this about someone else's actions? It's about his parents. Now, what is faith? We've talked about this many times. Things unseen, substance of things we haven't seen. What's that next word in verse 1? Substance of things hoped for, the evidence. Evidence. We've even talked about lately verse number 2. By faith, the elders have obtained a good testimony. There is a message. Who taught the elders of the New Testament church what they were to say and not? God. Verse 3, by faith we understand that the worlds of old were created by the words of God. So it's historical, it's informational, and it gives me supplement information about things I've never seen, but it's evidence that it's there. Who told Moses' parents to hide Moses? God. They didn't do this because they had no direction and they were just on their own. They asked God, God, what do we do? Do we honor the government? Do we honor you? What's the problem here? I think they saw, just like we saw a few years ago, there's an issue that's going on, and it's causing us to compromise our values. We can't do that. So God, what do we do? Well, God told them what to do. You hide Moses. Now I go back to chapter 2 with that in mind. Verse number 2, Exodus 2. When the woman conceived and bore a son, she saw that he was a beautiful child and hid him 3 months. But when she could no longer hide him, she took an ark of bulrushes for him, dabbed it with asphalt and pitch, and put the child in it, and laid it in the reeds by the river's bank. And his sister stood, that's Miriam, stood afar off to know what would be done to him. Now, can someone summarize to me what's going to happen after this child leaves the push of his very anxious mother? Pharaoh's daughter finds him. Okay, Miriam asks questions. That's going to be important here in a second. And then what was Pharaoh's daughter's response to that? Go find the mother, and she gets child support along with taking care of her own child. Man, that sounds like ideal parenting. I have this thing from the Lord. Lord, give me money, please. Well, he did that for Jochebed. Definitely took care of her in that way. Now, when I look at that story as a whole, Pharaoh's daughter understood because she did not kill the child to begin with. This is a life. This is a baby. Just like any Egyptian child, this is a baby, even though it's Hebrew. It's still a child. A child's a child. Egyptian, Hebrew, those are just ethnicities. That's all that is. That is not the humanity. It's a child. In her appeal towards her humanity, she understood taking a life is wrong. What her dad was asking for, or what her Pharaoh was asking for, she could not comply with. In fact, when you look at what God did with her and how she responded by saying, I need someone to take care of this child because I can't. What I find in Exodus 2 is what the book of Exodus should have been all along. Pharaoh should have been trying to, the Pharaoh in chapter 1, instead of causing hard, rigorous labor to occur, he could have made allies with Israel. They could have been a powerhouse to be dealt with, because who can stand against God's own people? If Pharaoh simply would have, men, we tend to get angry a lot, and sometimes we can't see past that anger. It's just us. It's what we are. The women here actually showcase what should have happened. Chapter 1, God blessed 2 women because they feared God more than they did a man who had an anger issue and he was just worried about something. He couldn't validate it. In chapter 2, I find that Jochebed, woman, Pharaoh's daughter, woman, and a young girl helped take care of God's future deliverer. Praise God for women who fear the Lord. That's what I find in chapter 1 and 2. Now, it's not just Jochebed, because the story is it doesn't really give us much insight on Amram. But if I find in Hebrews chapter 11 that it would say that the parents, that's plural, did not fear the command of the Lord, Amram's doing something in the background here, but it doesn't really tell us what. This is called influence. When I begin to look at how Moses develops from the end of the middle of chapter 2, beginning in verse number 11, I find that after the deal between Pharaoh's daughter and Jochebed is made, 40 years transpire. And what I find Moses doing here in this text is he begins to help some of his Hebrew brethren, one of which was being oppressed by an Egyptian. And his thought is, well, maybe God put me here to deliver his people. While that's true in the long run, God's answer at this moment was, you're not ready. You're not ready. And it took another 40 years. The man was 80 years old, and God said, you're going to lead over 2 million people. That's crazy, crazy. But I say that to say this. In chapter 11, let's go back there, and I want us to look at the influence of Moses. I've got some questions as to why did he decide to do these things. Hebrews chapter 11, and we'll begin in the verse after we just read, verse 23. We'll begin in verse 24. Now we'll read 24 to 28. And there's a certain verse, I'm pretty sure it's going to come up in question, but we'll talk about that here in a second. Hebrews 11, verse 24. By faith, Moses, when he became of age, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the passing pleasures of sin, esteeming the reproaches of Christ greater riches than the treasures in Egypt, for he looked to the reward. By faith he forsook Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is invisible. By faith he kept the Passover and the sprinkling of the blood, lest he who destroyed the firstborn should touch them. Now verse 28 deals more with chapter 7 to chapter 13. But if I'm looking at verse 24 to 27, I find two specific by faiths. By faith, when Moses became of age, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. Who taught him who he was? Probably his mother. I think at times, probably even his father. He'd be there. Now, I don't know if he had the indirect way of fatherly teaching or the direct way. The indirect way is father's messing with something in the corner and he's overhearing and he makes a comment to kind of correct something, and that's indirect fathering. It's effective somehow. But then there's also the direct, where it's like, Dad, no, stop. But I don't know. But what I do find is somehow Moses had caught wind through his upbringing that he was a Hebrew. In fact, if you notice in verse number 25, what do you think compelled him to choose suffering rather than to enjoy this exalted position in a palace? If you were chosen between where you live right now versus living with everything paid for and everybody's doing everything for you and you'll have absolutely nothing to worry about, that's actually a lie. You will have something to worry about. Which of those two would you prefer? The same burdens you have or less burdens? Now, in the immediate approach, there are less burdens. In the long run, there are so many more burdens by taking on more things. More money, more problems. Yes. And that would be those who would be consumed by greed or consumed by fortune. God provides things. We were just talking about in English class, we were looking at Matthew 6, and it talks about don't worry about what you'll eat, don't worry about what you'll drink, don't worry about what clothing you'll wear. God worries more about, and he uses nature illustrations for all three of these. God worries about the birds of the air. He feeds them. God clothes the flower of the field. He looks at the grass and he helps it to grow, but the grass eventually is going to go away. The grass eventually or the flowers are eventually going to go away. The birds are eventually going to go away. But what about you and I? We have a place we're going to. We have a place that is an eternal home. Those other aspects of creation do not. So when I look at the value that God places on me, who taught Moses that suffering with his own people was much better than being in the Palisades? His parents. Someone had to teach him the difference between godly fear and worldly fear. Worldly fear will drive you up the wall. It will lead you into so much medication that it will just mess you up more. Not saying if you're on medication, you're messed up, but we're all messed up a little bit. It depends on how you view that. But somebody had to teach him that there was something about God's people that was worth suffering for. In fact, notice the beginning of verse 25. It was his choice, choosing to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the passing pleasure of sin. Now, if I look at this, it doesn't say he chose to suffer because that's where all the rest of his family was. It's wonderful to be with my family. Sometimes. It's wonderful to be with my family if I can be with them, if I have a choice. But what if my family decides not to follow God? You think God's going to, kind of like the child who's holding on to the toy for dear life and says, I want to give it away, I want to give it away, no. And then when you ask them to pick what toys they want to keep and which ones they don't, they're keeping all of them. They didn't actually choose. You've got to make a choice for them. Who taught Moses that it was more than just your family to be considerate about? Who taught him about God's people? His parents did. Now, you know what's also interesting? Who would have taught him that there may be times you need to stand up against your own family? His parents would have. In fact, he does. Chapter 32 of Exodus, he stands up against his brother. Aaron, why did you cause the people to sin? I don't know. I threw this gold in there and there was a calf. Aaron was making excuses. You get to Numbers chapter 12 and you find the feud between Aaron and Miriam where they both are angry with Moses and Moses has to stand up against them. Not because it's enjoyable. That's not the fact at all. But I fear God. I fear God. That's why I'm choosing what I'm choosing. I don't want you to be lost, but I need you to know this is the side we need to be on. In fact, in the golden calf incident, does anybody remember what Moses said after he had talked with Aaron before the people were slain? What statement did he make to the Levites before he began to clear the camp? If you are on the Lord's side, you will stand with me. Now that was not a statement of arrogance. That's how it is. If you're not on the Lord's side, you're going to perish with these other people. And there were some Levites who stood with Moses and they cleansed the camp of the impurity. Moses knew how to stand against his family, even if it meant standing against them because they weren't standing for the right. In this case, we're seeing comfort versus discomfort. Someone had to teach him that it's worth suffering for God is so much more important than just enjoying the pleasures and all the wonderful things that life has to offer. At the end of all that, the wonderful things are no longer wonderful because they're all temporary. They will not take you where you think they're going to take you. So when I look at verse 25, he chose to suffer with the people of God than to enjoy the, now notice this, passing pleasures of sin. Who taught him the difference between what's a sin against God and what's fearing God? Probably his parents who feared God, and that's exactly what it said in verse number 23 and also back in Exodus 2. So when I look further into this, verse 26, he esteemed the reproaches of Christ, now that's an interesting statement, greater than the riches and treasures in Egypt, for he looked to the reward. If you read ancient history, you will find that the Egyptian powerhouse was basically the Roman Empire, the original Roman Empire. They were the dogs of the ancient world. They had everything. They had the trade. They had all the craftsmen. They had all the wisdom and the philosophy and the schools. And it's something that continued even into the first century. But when I'm looking at the prestige of this mighty nation, did you know that God ultimately destroyed that nation? Because they would not let God's people go. Now, when it says this statement that he chose the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures in Egypt, what's the problem with that statement, at least on observation initially? Think time-wise. You're in the days of Moses. Who are you not going to be talking about? Because he doesn't exist yet. Jesus. How in the world can he suffer the reproaches of Christ? That's not what this text is saying. When we're looking at the reproaches of Christ, let's consider what Christ did. Who reproached Jesus during his lifetime? And by that I mean like caused harm, ultimately considered him guilty, even though he was innocent, and ultimately killed him. Those are the reproaches of Christ that are under consideration. Be the Jews. Be the Jews. Now, was he suffering wrongfully? Yeah, he was. So what happens if you're trying to do the right thing, but then you're suffering because you're trying to do the right thing? That's the idea. Just like Christ suffered, he was willing to suffer for the cause of God more than this lowercase g God who is arrogant and prideful and ultimately going to destroy himself, which that's exactly what he does. More than likely, the Pharaoh during the time of when Moses kills the Egyptian, that particular Pharaoh, his son, may have also been the inline combatant with Moses for the throne. So he'd basically be going toe-to-toe with his brother by adoption. So when we see how prideful and arrogant that he is, that could have been Moses, but Moses chose not to. Now notice one more thing, and then we want to make a connection with all this. Verse number 27, by faith he forsook Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king, but he endured as seeing him who is invisible. Isn't it wonderful if you had the ability to see things that are invisible? There'd be no dust in your house. By invisible, what are we talking about? What are we alluding to? I'll give you a hint. Romans 1, verse 20. Romans 1, verse 20. What do we mean by the invisible? What does it say? You know what's really cool? So that was written in the 1st century. This text is telling us about something that would have occurred a little over 1,400 years from when Romans 1 would have been pinned down. Get this, the Hebrew understanding, which they weren't really called Hebrews at this point, they were just called the children of Israel. They weren't given that national name quite yet. Who told them that you can see God, you can see something that is beyond the physical by asking questions about the physical? Did you know that the Hebrew people probably had more faith than what most individuals do today? They didn't have the rest of the scriptures. Who taught Moses about the invisible one? His parents. So when I'm looking at Moses deciding to forsake Egypt because he endured as seeing him who is invisible, Moses' parents were incredible by the principles they instilled within him. If it's between your family and standing with God, we want you to stand with God. You need to help your family, but stand with God. That is the place to be. It helped us, it redeemed us, it relieved us. Now, Moses' understanding in Exodus 2 was a little premature because it wasn't quite his time yet, but Moses was God's chosen spokesperson. When you look at the end of chapter 2 in Exodus, and it would say that God, after 40 years had passed, he listened or he saw the affliction of the Israelites, he heard their cry, and he sought to rescue them. That first 2 words in chapter 3, now Moses, that's the answer to God going to redeem his people. But Moses was 40 years too early. I think that goes to show that there is such thing as there is a proper time and a proper place for everything. And sometimes when I think maybe I'm the fulfillment of God's calling, God says, whoa, buddy, not yet, not yet, need some time. But who instilled that into him? His parents. Now, that is from a parenting aspect. I think Moses' parents knocked it out of the park. And I don't read anything about Jochebed and Amram after these events in chapter 2. Could they have still been alive when Moses came back? Maybe. Text doesn't say. Could they have been dead? Maybe. Text doesn't say. I do know this. If you were to look back into Egyptian slavery and look at this idea of rigorous slavery, you'd be lucky if you had a strong man who wasn't broken within 5 years and died. So with Amram living to be a very hefty amount, according to chapter 6, it seems like maybe he was worked to death. Jochebed, don't know. But let's do the flip side of this. Could it be possible that parenting could be done in such a way that it does not show biasness to the children? We talked about that with Isaac and Rebekah a little bit last week. They showed favoritism towards Jacob and Esau. That led to major repercussions, about 20 years separated because they didn't know how to talk to each other. When I look at how Amram and Jochebed worked in their family, they did not show favoritism to Miriam. They did not show favoritism to Aaron. They did not show favoritism to Moses. In fact, despite the belief system in Numbers, what they would say about Moses, God was not biased towards any of the children of Israel and or thought more about Moses in comparison to the others. They were all souls. It's just the responsibility God gave Moses put him in a position that there was so much more on his shoulders in comparison to the rest of the children of Israel. Think of it this way. If it came down between you and Moses, and God knew, okay, the person I'm going to choose is going to have to lead over 2 million people. He's going to have to listen to their bickering for over 40 years. He's going to have to learn how to want to kill them, but not kill them because that's murder. We can't do that, but learn how to be long-suffering and forgiving and forbearing toward them. I need someone who looks at these people the way that I want to look at these people. And that's exactly what I find in chapter 32, 33, and 34. Lord, this sin that the people have committed, blot me out of your book if you're going to take them out. Don't destroy your heritage. I think Moses needed to know that about himself. God's looking for people who care about his people the same way God does. God wasn't going to kill his people. He just needed Moses to see that. Now, if it came between you and Moses, would you want God to give you that responsibility? Or do you think maybe God's being careful about what he puts on your shoulders by choosing someone else to alleviate you from that? And that's another thing. Moses not only had a godly upbringing, but also he displayed a servanthood that is almost parallel to Jesus. It's not expressed that way until we get to Deuteronomy chapter 4 through about 12, where he begins to give insight about the law. And then you look at the Song of Moses in Deuteronomy 32 and 33, Moses begins to explain his heart, why he does what he does. In fact, Deuteronomy ends with, he was the meekest of all to live. Some claim he wrote that. Is that really meek if you write that? But despite that, it was because of his characteristics. Moses looked to God's people as God's heritage, and he wanted to treat them as such. Who taught Moses to care about other people like God would? His parents.
Look at Moses parallels to Jesus. And they're both born in a generation. Pharaoh is going to get
That is true.
both were taught the right way by their parents. Moses taught us law of Moses. Jesus taught the law from the beginning. They both chose suffering instead of not doing God's will. There's a lot of similarities, I think, between the two. Just one had to die of sin and the other didn't.
That's a wonderful parallel, and that's exactly right. We call that typology, seeing Christ through Moses, but you can kind of see that through all the major faith figures through the Old Testament. There's some kind of connection to Jesus, but it seems like there's just more than most other characters between Moses and Jesus. But that also goes to show, if you have more than one child, and you have a child who is wayward, I know a couple of situations over in Elizabethton where there are families who have multiple children. Some of them are wayward, some of them are not. Did you know that if you can at least get one of your children to fear God and put God above all things, even if their siblings fall away, do you know who probably is the best candidate to bring them back? Their siblings. It worked for Miriam, it worked for Aaron, it worked for the rest of the children of Israel, which is why we need to train up a child in the way he should go. Teach children in the nurture and the admonition of the Lord. And if you're in a household where it's split between one faithful and one not even a child of God, be the greater influence so that even when the world comes into the home, you've still won your child. That eventually can win the other parent. So thank you for your time and attention today. Really good comments. We'll go ahead, take a break for 15, and then we will come back for morning worship. Thank you.